have a series of accounts of the way in which the economic and the cultural, and by extension the humanistic, not only shape each other but limit each other to some degrees. And I think I'll just open to questions from the floor. Yes.
One of the interesting things I think about the quantitative social sciences is how they cling to epistemological determinism long after the natural sciences gave them up somewhere around, after Max Planck, it's not possible in physics. So a parallel story, although epidemiologists would never, of course, admit that they're social scientists, but it's the same activity of attempting to quantitatively calculate human somatic experience, and then attempt to calculate health risks on a population basis in the same. But even at that level of sophisticated mathematical modeling of human activity, even the social science of epidemiology has come to terms with the fact that you can't calculate population risk without understanding the relationship between culture and behavior and the spread and the risk of particularly chronic disease. And it's interesting to see. So it's interesting to see epidemiologists who you think would be the last people in the world to link up with medical anthropologists to try and integrate a form of quantitative and qualitative knowledge in order to produce more accurate interpretations on which to base public health policy. And it's interesting to see the contrasting epistemological profile of economics, which kind of belligerently retains its sort of intellectual isolationism from philosophical relativism and the other social sciences. It's a comment more than a question.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't disagree with you. In fact, the much longer version of this talk was originally called a paper called "Mr. Smith Goes to Olympus Alone," and the point was precisely that about, I mean, I think the only thing I would do is I would add on to your point a point about what is often an equal epistemological naivete on the humanistic side, right? So that an awful lot of humanists seem to think that once they can establish that what they are doing is not like physics, then they have established that it has nothing to do with science.
Oh, right.
Right? And as if geology, evolutionary biology, etc., didn't exist. Right?
As if the other human sciences didn't have hundreds of years of history. Yes.
Right. It's a very weird phenomenon. I've actually, in the process, I think, of co-editing a volume with an evolutionary biologist at the Santa Fe Institute. Right. And talking with him has been very interesting. Because in some sense we share this interest in, hey, we're interested in mapping change over time. Right. We're interested in looking at processes where, the number of cases equals 1. Right. And yet we want to be reasonably rigorous about them. So there's a lot we share, and then there are places where we just look at each other and say, but you can't do that.
Right.
David, just a quick intervention for our transcript, if you could introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, yes, I'm Dorothy Porter, and I'm from UCSF.
Your transcript.
I have a few questions, probably several will come to mind as I start to talk, but Stephen Cullenberg was a Reg McGinnis, yes. Referring to Adam Smith and the 1750s and the conjunction of economic thought with reflection on the sublime and astronomy. And Marcel Hénaff was inviting us to take a longer view of the question about economics. And just along those lines, Marcel was also referring to the role of religion in the modern context, perhaps as being something that could provide meaning, which the market presently is unable to do. The market, which would claim to embrace everything nonetheless. But just a couple thoughts that I'll send back to you on those same lines, because I work on French rather, and emergence of the school of the physiocrats, which is more or less the same time as Adam Smith, as you were referring to, had something to do with the idea that if you could discover the rules of nature, that you could unveil those rules and allow a system to take shape based on those rules, that it would be somehow self-regulating. It would take after everything. It would look after everything. It would be a kind of government of things by nature. And it is something, it seems to me the formulation is not entirely foreign to what you say, Marcel, referring to Marcel Mauss, the idea of a total social phenomenon, because there is the idea, at first, I think, with the physiocrats, that economics was supposed to be the government or a theory of the whole social realm, and not just the science of wealth. It became the science of wealth afterwards, I believe. So I just throw that back to you. And I know one of the things I wanted to say in addition to that was that you had this, the context in which the physiocrats become a school, the first school of French economics, at least in modern times, is on the heels of the project of the encyclopedia. And much of the story of the publication of Diderot and d'Alembert's encyclopedia has to do with the conflict or the polemic between religion and philosophy. The book was in fact censored, having to do with its critique of religion. And so I'm wondering if the kind of questions that we're struggling with today, that you alluded to on this panel, if we do well to look at these coming from a long way off, and these are some thoughts that I think of along those lines. That's to say, the idea that economics, in a certain sense, I say this is a hypothesis, takes center stage in France in the last decades of the 18th century, and in a way sort of filling a vacuum, perhaps, left by religion. And that the notion of a self-regulating system based on laws was already something being put forward there, and maybe that's still made it all the way to us, and that we're finding today, as we talk, that there is something missing, the question of meaning, for instance.
Well, it's a very complex question. The relation between the physiocrat and Adam Smith is well known. He was very much inspired by Quenet and Mirabeau, the Senior, and some others, Dupont de Nemours, and whatever. So, your question is about first relation to nature, and their position was that nature is giving the first investment for free. So it's that's what they call physiocrat, because they have this no economic development is possible without its first gift of nature. And also this is, I'm not sure, is also in the Gary Baker theory, or making confusion with someone else. But anyway, something is given first. The problem, your main point, I think, is about economy and religion, and this development of the economic theory in the 18th century. It is interesting to see that the economists has developed their theory in a parallel way, meaning with they were not considered as true philosophers. And the concept of public space or the state or politics were one thing, and the economists have developed a theory which was we ignore the mainstream, let's say, the philosophical tradition. They developed their own view, and in that sense, they offer a theory which is the beginning of this concept of the market as capable of integrating the entire society, of self-regulating process. And yes, in some ways is let's say, spontaneously non-religious theory. But it would be too simplistic to understand the relation in that way. And we know the other big study on that is Max Weber, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Our religion can not provoke, but at least help a certain development of economy based on certain religious values. So what we see today, and that was my point, is that distribution of tasks, even it's more developed, even increase. You take care of meta values, or what is supposed to be the invisible or the supreme values in life, and we take care of the material goods and develop it. It doesn't work like that. The truth is that market has this capability to control everything by financial networks, including religion. We see that everywhere. So that is the logic of that process, I think. So it started, what you describe in the 18th century, to me, is the beginning of this same time split and the power of the market, the economy in general, but the market in particular, to take control of everything in the society. And by the way, when Mauss speaks of total social phenomenon, it is about integration. It's not about domination. In the case of the market, it's more about domination than integration. It's how to control everything, not to really give to everything a possibility to stay together. And the result is what we see. We are not, it doesn't produce social bond. On the opposite, it provokes inequalities and a permanent struggle for recognition between groups. So this is, I don't know if I addressed your question. You know, the problem with the question, or when you ask, as Valérie said, when you ask a question to a philosopher, you don't understand the question, you have to ask yourself in the first place, after the answer.
But doesn't your point make reinforce Reggie's point, really, that what you're just describing is the market fulfilling the aesthetic faith of the sublime that's been advocated by religion, through secularization at the end of the 18th century. I mean, in a sense, you're making even a stronger case for the market becoming because religious faith fulfilled the function of domination and perpetuated permanent conflict rather than integration, but produced domination, not integration. I mean, in that sense, your point is reinforcing Reggie's thesis, hypothesis, really, that the market is an object of the sublimity, it takes over the function of the aesthetics of faith.
Yeah, I agree. I think we can understand the process in the way you describe it. The question is always the question of money in all of this. It's not just market as an entity. We have to be careful with this, like the capital market. But it's really a network of procedures, which is the financial control of, and we see that with our universities. Is all about how the market, how to marketize in some ways the education, which is a public good. So it's a conflict we are facing now, for instance, in the UC system, and the trend to privatize more and more is functioning.
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand this common trend or strand, rather, and I'm not sure I see the market as opposed to religion. I would see it as very close to religion in some other ways, and this would be the way. For example, the market rests on this unquestioned notion of preferences, which you have to take it as a leap of faith that, for example, this notion is the origin of other notions, that you can bring things down to a preference, as if we didn't know or we did not believe, as you actually said, that preferences are the consequence of other things and not the origin of something. Or, again, with the notion of the fake and true, I think that the whole phenomenon of fakeness is actually a great leap of faith into the market, into those values, towards, how would I say, a leap of faith that those values are really predominant. For example, if you imitate a brand, you are paying tribute to that brand. You think that that brand is really important. If you're defending the brand, you're also paying tribute and thinking that the brand is important. Faking or imitation or plagiarism would not work if you didn't care in this kind of blind religious way about the sublimity of a certain brand that has to be copied. Because if you just copy one wheel by another wheel, it's not called plagiarism, it's just called adaptation, normal. So in some ways, you have to have this faith that there's something unique and sublime about this that you cannot copy or whatever. So for me, and what we were saying earlier about what gives meaning, I'm just thinking maybe the market is okay to use as a set of instructions on how to organize exchange, but what is strange there is that it becomes an object of faith, of religion, basically, that actually it will carry some meaning such as profit that will be above other things. While I totally agree to use it as a means of exchange, like rules of the game. You give me this, I'll give you this, so that can be market. So I'm just trying to see what is it in the market that makes it so close to what I see as unfounded religion, basically. I don't know if this is like a question for everybody. I'm not sure that makes sense.
Preference.
Okay. All right.
Problem of preference.
Okay. I think one thing that we're all pointing to, and none of us have quite done, and in part because you can't do it in a brief compass, is to remember that the phrase "the market" stands for so many different things, and you want to be very, very careful about the slippages there. Mm-hmm. Right? It is, on the one hand, an institution, right, in which certain sorts of things happen. As you say, there are rules of the game. And we have to remember that they're not always the same rules of the game, right? I mean, the New York Stock Exchange is a market, and so is the flea market on Sundays at Orange Coast College, and they function really, really differently, and power manifests itself very, very differently. And part of what we want to get at is the specificity of particular markets. And part of what I think, and I probably said this too quickly in my talk, that certain kinds of economic analysis are actually very good at when we apply them carefully, is saying, given a certain set of institutions that govern a particular market, how might we expect that market to function, right? So that if you have certain rules of, so when we talk about bargaining over who's going to pay for an accident, right? It's true that most of those disputes settle out of court, but the bargaining takes place in the shadow of the law. If you set down certain rules to begin with, it will govern what kind of likely results you're going to get. And game theory actually is pretty good at telling you a lot about those things. But when we start to say that is the market, rather than that's a particular market, we get into real trouble. There's also, I think, a further kind of level, which is the market not as any institution at all, but as a sort of almost a Platonic ideal, right? This thing that we invoke that I think does come very close to religion, right? The market will solve things. And there, I think, we want to be careful about labeling any moment as, the moment where X happened, as if, there was an age of religion and then an age of secularism. And, after all, religion didn't die in the late 18th century. But I think, if you jump to contemporary life, one of the things that is really, I think, stunning about, maybe the United States in particular, but to some extent the capitalist world in general, is, and here I come back to Salins again, this very bizarre notion that we have that we don't have a culture, right? That our world is that of transparent utility, right? And that therefore you can model it according to rules of the market, capital T, capital M, right? When, of course, even the most casual look at things tells you, it's not some transparent notion of utility that makes, steak far more expensive than liver and far more prestigious to eat, at least in the United States, and horse barely edible at all, and so on and so forth. So that's yet another level, that of the market as some imagined realm in which it's all about a transparent utility. And I think that, that needs to be distinguished from particular markets, which in turn need to be distinguished from each other. And economics is pretty good sometimes at analyzing the latter. It's rarely good at analyzing the former.
I think at this point in this conversation, there are perhaps two conflations I think I'd like to separate out. One is the equation, not that I've heard this, but I think it's lurking behind, the equation between the market and capitalism. They're not the same thing. Even in the world we exist in today, even in the United States of America, right, you might say the United States is a global capitalist economy. That's one way of representing what we live in. But how do you explain the 15% of the people in the United States who are self-employed? 15% are self-employed. I wouldn't say they're capitalists. It's not wage labor. It's not for profit. But they engage in market behavior. People who work in governments, they're not capitalist employees. People, even all of us in the university, we're not capitalist employees. We're a lot of people. Most of the production in the United States is taking place at home, in households. So that, by that measure, not most, but most of the labor, let's say, most of the labor is taking place, if you measure that, it's taking place in households. By that measure, then, what kind of economy do we have? We have a very heterogeneous type of economy, which needs to be thought about and represented and thought and theorized. The other thing is, I think you need to think about theorization of economies or even economics. Don't think that economists have, this is part of what I was trying to make the point of, the purchase on how to think about economies. When we think about going to a grocery store like Ralph's and saying, we'll go to a market, you take an introductory microeconomics class, you learn a little bit of game theory, but you also can learn demand and supply curves. You think that's a market. You believe very quickly as an economist or a budding little economist that the demand and supply curves are the truth, going back to your epistemological point, and that there's no theoretical move there that says that this is a metaphor to think about what goes on in Ralph's. I walk into Ralph's all the time. I never see demand and supply curves. So tell me where they are. Right? Tell me where they are. Tell me where the market is, the labor market. We talk about the labor market all the time. Where is the labor market? Maybe there's a market someplace you can go to and you can point to a geographical location, but in many cases you can't. And to say that the demand and supply curves represent the market is one way to think about what goes on in Ralph's when you go shop. Sure. Not only represent the economy, but to construct notions of the economy, which are equally valid, I think, in any fundamental epistemological way than what economists do, but they're not dominant in that sense, but they're ever present and they're important and they need to be studied. And I think that this conflation that we have between markets and capitalism is a problem, because markets have pre-existed capitalism, this is my thinking, and they will post-exist. They're also there outside of capitalism today, but also how we think about economics is not just what goes on in the economics. I don't know what building the economics department is in here, but it's not what goes on in the economics department. It's also outside of the economics department. Everybody can talk about, just like economists can talk about value and culture. And I think once you start thinking that way, then it raises all kinds of questions.
But isn't what Marcel's talking about is the imaginary that's created by economic science? I mean, to an extent, the conflation of capitalism and market and the market is a product of economic science.
I agree with that.
Economic activity.
I agree with that.
Economic activity has, exchange has gone on throughout all human, in all human societies. The exchange of goods and wealth and meaning, for that matter, is a fundamental component of all human social interaction. But the idea of the market as an imaginary is the product of economic science, and it has, many parallels to the idea of the divine created by religious organization and religious knowledge.
But one of the things
it has the sublime aesthetics of faith. As an inherent component of the imaginary.
But just one thing you'll see in economics profession, the professional economists, is they don't talk about capitalism. They do not. They talk about markets and economy. And I don't think they want to talk about capitalism because it's a short step from capitalism to surplus labor to exploitation to different modes of production, which is, damn it, something they don't want to recognize as legitimate discourse to talk about economics.
If I could just add on to that, and the other thing is there's a short, from talking about capitalism, it's a very short step to saying there can be different kinds of social organization, because capitalism implies the existence of some non-capitalists, and they might have different economic laws of motion. Right? Whereas mainstream economics is premised on the notion that there's one set of economic laws of motion, and they apply whether you're in the Pacific Northwest pre-Columbus, or whether you're on Wall Street, or whether you're in your house deciding who's going to cook dinner and who's going to watch the kids.
Yeah.
I was going to say, ask Professor Cullenberg, you were implying that because we are government employees, we are not capitalists, but we don't participate in capitalist economy. And then I was thinking about that. I was thinking, well, I was also frustrated by certain kinds of lack of differentiation that we were making in the discussion. But then I was thinking that aren't we all here by virtue of something called the labor market, that somehow our value has been assessed and monetized and we are all employed by this large organization, and because we went through some kind of market vetting, they called labor market. So one of the critical things that I feel this discussion, I'd like to try to focus on this discussion is not so much the religious aspect, but the question of labor and the differentiation of labor, and yes, moving towards exploitation, all of that. And then this moves to Marcel's point that what worries, not worries me, but what is really truly alarming is for me this radical non-differentiation of labor power from human life now. There's no, everything is reduced then to this question of leveraging our existence as economic beings with regard to a market in which our economic existence is more and more precarious. As members of a mass middle class, I would say, as government employees, we are all more or less part of this mass middle class. That part of the question of the non-functionality of this economic sublime is the fact that what I actually can't quite put my finger on is the radical destabilization of labor within this market that's within the economic structures of large organizations like this one, which seem to be permeated by market values, even though they're sort of supposed to be autonomous from those kinds of market values. So,
just a very quick
question. So, are we part of a labor market? Or are we separate from the market and capitalism because we're government employees?
When I think of capitalism, I think of three things. I think of wage labor. I think of products sold as commodities on a market. So the market's involved. And
do you think of division of labor at all? Or?
And profit. So what I don't see in a university and I don't see in public employees is profit. I don't see profit.
You don't see profit.
Is that that's a differentiation.
Well, there's generation of surplus which is then reinvested into the surplus or loss.
But doesn't produce surplus value. Right.
But I will say that I don't mean to say that the university or public. Let's just say the university because that's what we're focusing on. The university is not affected by capitalism or capitalist relations. It certainly is, but it's not itself a capitalist relation. Is my estimation, because we're not in this business for profit.
But it's not involved in the reproduction.
There are some for-profit universities.
I mean, it's not part of a system that reproduces labor for the labor force or certain kinds of production of product that enters into markets which produce.
Does it? But it also produces revolutionaries. It produces artists. It produces all kinds of strange people.
But it also produces competition and exploitation.
Our labour doesn't produce surplus value.
That's right. That's my point.
And
Dorothy's making the same point.
Well, I mean, our labour meaning our labour in certain quarters of the academy. But I mean, the academy, you know.
I think I work in an institution where there are intellectuals who come closest to producing surplus value from their labour.
And engineering doesn't, and computer science doesn't, and I mean, come on.
Yes,
I mean,
the professional schools,
yeah.
Well, I don't know whether they're actually, if they're employed by all, if the engineers are employed by industrial organisations, yes, then in their role in that. But if they're involved in academic research and development that's not allied to the industrial exploitation of that knowledge, then they don't produce surplus value.
I mean, that's in part true, but I mean, Ken's warning that we should not hypothesize the market, I think, can be extended to say that we should not hypothesize any single market as singularly about one thing. So, the university is not, doesn't function in a singular way. I mean, there are for-profit universities, there are universities that are private, and there are nominally now public universities.
And there's the new hybrids, where you have scientific labour that's producing surplus value.
I think it would be a mistake to consider the University of California a profit-making or a capitalist enterprise. I think it's a mistake. I think it's a conflation that misses all the complexities of what exists in this world. And therefore, I think a household where people do child care and do food care and all kinds of care it's a mistake to conflate that with a capitalist relationship.
Well, let me pose a question differently. Would
people labor? There's no question people labor.
Would the University of California today, in all its complexity...
I knew we were getting to the University of California.
Right, well, you brought it up. I mean, could it have existed in a pre-capitalist formation?
Maybe in a post-capitalist.
I don't know. That's a different question to me.
Does it serve the function of class reproduction? Because I think a lot of what we do is reproduce the middle class.
Well, absolutely.
We also produce revolutionaries.
Enterprise. Does it function in any way with regard to class?
Complexly, it does. Of course, it does.
Class at all, in your view?
Of course, it does. But what do you do with these artists at UC San Diego who are undermining the UC system?
Minority. I mean, more power to them. And let's say it's an expansive institution that can also foster complex, diverse dissidents. But its major function is to reproduce class. Could we say that?
Well, yeah.
Well, you could take a kind of 19th century view of it as just a function of the reproduction of bourgeois culture, which is essential to the reproduction of capitalist economic organization. Yes, you can take that view. But I think that would be to undermine the complexity of what universities as social and cultural institutions have become since they were since the kind of model of the university as a place where knowledge is pursued for its own sake was set up, let's say, in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century. I think that would be a historically crude interpretation of them as institutions, in terms of the history of them as institutions.
Sorry.
Susan Anderson from UC Riverside. I want to ask, I want to sort of play with this question that comes from Marcel's comment about the gift as a total social phenomenon that was integrative rather than the market as a total social phenomenon which is dominating. And then Dorothy said at some point when we were talking about the Enlightenment and the emergence of economic science as we know it with Smith and the physiocrats, something about religion being a dominating system, and
Organized religion, yeah.
Organized religion. And I wonder if that's another set of polarities we want to unpack a little bit. Because it seems to me, and I'm a historian of 17th century England, so that's my sitting sort of, I think that's an important perch from which I think about this. But it seems to me that the integrative can also be very dominating. That is, the integrative creates in the modern context of peer pressure as an integrative, but not necessarily always dominating system. So I wonder if we could think about some of the ways in which these issues of economics are playing in the spaces between integration and domination, not one or the other. And that may actually, I think the fake really illuminates that as a way of sort of, here are these big corporations that are, in the front page of the business section of yesterday's New York Times had a long story about Microsoft's anti-piracy group. So here is Microsoft, this huge global corporation, constantly undermined, its domination always undermined by this. So I think there's some place between there that we need to understand, and that probably is helpful to unpack a little bit. And somewhere in here, and this is, I don't know where this is going, but this has just been in my head, so I'm going to say it and throw it out. I keep thinking about Hard Times and Mr. Gradgrind. And so the only reason I say that is it's easy to talk about this as a new set of problems, but it's clear, and Marcel's talk reflected that to some extent, but even within capitalism, this is not a phenomenon of late capitalism, but it takes a particular form in the era of late capitalism. I don't know. So I don't know where that goes, but anyway, that's a separate thought.
Well, study faith is like studying heresy. It's trying to save the Catholic Church through the study of heresy. Fakes
Ackbarism. We think.
Okay, let me just respond. I mean, I've been listening with great interest to this discussion, but it seems to me that what you're saying, that this whole question of the fake, for example, its value, is that it's this anomalous thing, like as a kind of economic object. It's an anomalous object, but it's also very specific and real. And I think it's really in relationship to these anomalous things that we will probably have to start thinking. And this, I think, takes me back to what Stephen is calling, sublime, the sublime economy. Because, and I think you were also saying that the cultural critic to go to when you think about the sublime is not Frederick Jameson. It's not Frederick Jameson because Jameson still has this notion of representation. And it's in relationship to representation, I think, that he's critiquing postmodernism. The way in which, for example, someone like Gerd Lukács was critiquing modernism, I mean, he appreciated a lot of what was going on, but he felt he could not accept it. Right? So, I mean, he was very perceptive about modernism, but at the same time, having to say he doesn't like it. I think that's the same case with Jameson. I mean, you can see Jameson as a kind of, Lukács of postmodernism. But I think, but where this takes us to would be this whole question of how whatever you want to call it, markets, culture, religion, how all these things have become so complex that you can't really describe them directly. I mean, that's where I think that the relationship between someone like Adam Smith and his interest in astronomy, for me, makes a lot of sense. Especially contemporary astronomy with its notion of the black hole. I mean, this idea that the black hole is there, but you can never see it. How do you know it exists? Through the effects that it produces. And what do we call these effects? These effects are exactly what we call the economy, the market, religion, culture, and so on. And I think that's where...
Hand.
Right?
The invisible hand.
Yeah.
It's the black hole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's where I think these things might link up. So, you know, if you say, let's say the economy is everywhere, which is true, you could just as well say that the culture is everywhere, which is true. Or you could say even today, religion is everywhere. Right? I mean, but the everywhere here, I think, means something like this, right? That it's like this observation made by about God before, right? God is this thing where the circumference is everywhere, but the center is nowhere. Right? I mean, it's this whole decentered notion of what something is. Whether this something is what you call the market or culture or which is what we're talking about, right? Economics and the humanities. So possibly one starting point, one way in which you could link these things would be through maybe a kind of, shall we say, a kind of critique of the notion of what representation is. So, like, for example, economics should not be seen as a way of representing some activity that you might call the economy. I mean, so it's not a question of representing it. What it does would be it really studies all these traces, right? All the anomalies, all the things that, as it were, like it or not, seep into social life and cultural life, and it's these traces that we would need to. So you're going from, shall we say, a methodology of representation, which I think in a very sophisticated way, someone like Jameson is still in, to what you might call a methodology of the trace, right? Where by the trace we mean all these anomalous things, all these things that surprise us, right? All these things that cannot fit. Right? I mean, that becomes a very different approach.
Wayne McCready. I wondered if some of the panelists wanted to address the role and function of authority in economics. For someone, I teach religious studies and I've done so for about 100 years. And trying to get traction on how to deal with multiple religions, aside from the characteristics of use of God and Scripture and so on, I have found it helpful to address how authority is presented on one side, and then the question of acceptance of authority on the other side. And thinking about economics is not even close to being an obvious, but I'm always surprised at how authoritatively it seems to be a force in our society, and then how we seem to accept it, and certainly now trying to administer humanities institutes in large, complex universities, it has a force of its own, and keep going on. At what stage did it gain this authority that we can't even question? Like I'm filling out my business plan now, and I used to be able to avoid the term business plan, but now it's in the template. I can't possibly change it, which means I'm filling out a business plan, even though I don't perceive myself or what I do as a business. And it's not so much the timeline as much as how does authority function, and then its role in economics. So a question like why is there error?
I was going to say, little question.
It might be related related, Marina Stefanovska, by the way, might be related to the question of who gives meaning. Who is the voice to give meaning? I can only quote a good aphorism by Pascal, who says that might has disguised itself as justice and says, I am justice, and therefore everybody who has justice is therefore has to obey force because it's disguised. So in some ways, I can maybe say that this authority has been usurped, to use Pascal's terms, by disguising itself into the meaning-giving element or institution, which in fact we as humanists, I think, should deny it. Yeah, you're fine, you're right, but what do you mean? Nothing. You only mean profit, so what's that? So I don't know. Like take over the question of meaning from economics.
Well, it's just going to make a joke.
I think we want to be careful here to distinguish between the authority of forced economizing, in other words, the authority of austerity, of a budget, and the authority of a discipline called economics. Right? I mean, bureaucratic superiors have been telling bureaucratic inferiors for as long as they have existed, you cannot spend more than X, right? And that's a kind of economic constraint. But its authority does not depend on the existence of a discipline of economics, right? That's a very different sort of thing. I mean, we may be feeling it particularly painfully now because of things that are happening in the larger economy. But, you know, I think we want to be careful about rolling those two together. Right? That's quite different from the intellectual claims of the discipline of economics or of certain strands within it to have a master theory of how economizing should work. Right? Those are not quite the same thing. I mean, when we talk about the latter, about why does a particular kind of economics, because we should remember that there are an awful lot of people doing what they consider to be economics who are not going to be consulted by the Fed or whatever.
Like Paul Krugman or somebody like that.
Well, not only Paul Krugman, but right. I mean, there are many, many people out there analyzing economic phenomena. Some of them within economics departments who don't fit this current American mainstream. And so are, they may be card-carrying members of the AEA, but they're not what we mean when we talk about the power of economics.
Well, no,
right?
You can give a Marxist, a very old-fashioned Marxian answer to this question, which is that, of course, economic power is the driving force of historical reproduction of history, and that's the authority that you're talking about. There is the authority of economic power.
It's an interesting point is the birth of the discipline called economics is that, and has to do with physics, is that for the first time in the field of social actions and reproduction, a science could be done of this law, could be defined or discovered. So this authority of the economists, for them, come from the fact that they can pretend to discover regularities that have the same status of regularity that physicians can find in nature.
The operative word there is pretend.
I'm sorry?
The operative word is pretend.
Yeah, pretend. Yes,
economists can do nothing of its sort of its claims.
Yeah.
I mean, and one of the things that's really interesting, I teach a graduate course every year, doing this for many years now. In the second year for the graduate students in the economics program at UC Riverside. And I teach a course it's called economic methodology, which is basically economic philosophy, a lot of things that Kim was talking about. And by the time they're in the second year, they do not believe it's possible to reject the theory of rational choice theory. You can't do it empirically, you can't do it theoretically. I try and I try and I try. I bring in Amartya Sen's work, Rational Fools, all kinds of, but they can always reconceive of an object or a question as being a rational choice problem. It may not be solved, it may be even solvable, but they can always conceive of it as that way. They're so, I don't know if you want to say brainwashed, but they're so convinced at that point in time of the dominance of economics in 2 years' time that it's really, I don't know how to explain it. Try to say to them different ways of understanding what goes on in, say, a firm, a company, than just thinking about rational choice or those kinds of trade-offs. I mean, it's hard if you really believe it, it's hard to get away from. The other thing I want to say, too, is that the dominance of economics as a profession, the rational choice paradigm is there, there's no question, even for people like Paul Krugman.
Right.
But the kind of mainstream dominance of free market fetishism that destroyed the financial markets that we were in recently has been a completely different world. And that's something that I think economists should be held responsible for. The economic theories that they developed were responsible for much of the destruction that we faced in the last couple of years of our economy, because people believe those theorems, not all economists do, but those who do propagated those, and they had politicians who accepted that. It's like a bad doctor telling you, this is the reason why you're sick, and they know it's wrong. They make these things on specious assumptions and the models that don't exist in reality, and then they're held responsible. Somebody should start to hold economists responsible for the theories that they develop.
Can I just add one little footnote to that, which is I think the point Steve made about how once you have been accustomed to a certain way of framing things, it's always possible to save the appearances, no matter what critique is made. I mean, as economists have tried, for instance, to move into political science, one of the things that's really potentially tripped them up is the phenomenon of voting, right? Because rationally,
we have an answer for that.
Well, except that the answer is now this thing called identity interests. And I mean, that's like adding another Ptolemaic epicycle, right? I mean, if you define interests broadly enough, then sure, everything is the rational pursuit of your interests.
Yeah.
But
Sorry, Georgia has been trying to ask a question for some time. Georgia Wonka.
Georgia Wonka from the Humanities Center, the Center for Ideas and Society at Riverside. I had a just question about this. I mean, I think we take Steve's point that we shouldn't be talking about the capitalism or the market, that there are lots of different markets, and that they function differently. Then one sort of question that comes up when you're talking about economics and humanities is if we wanted to kind of stave off this kind of market mentality taking over all aspects of life and kind of make a distinction between the market and the life world, or the kind of other things we do besides engage in market transactions, then one thing that the humanities should be thinking about and talking about, it seems to me, is what things that can't be bought and sold, and how we talk about those, and how we make it clear that, I mean, if the economy, if the so-called market intrudes on every aspect of life, it's because we let it, right? I mean, there isn't some market out there, this fiendish market, which is gobbling up aspects of the life world. It's that the life world, the people in the life world are not defending things as non-market values. And so, I think that a lot of the kind of talk, even here, is about sort of non-Lukácsian in the sense that it's not getting behind the reification, and it's not saying, look, there is no market, there are people. There are people making transactions, and they can either decide that they're not going to do certain, I don't know. But also, I also wanted to say that I don't think that it makes sense to say that the market is always domineering or dominating, and that the gift is always integrating. I think sometimes gifts can be, I'd much rather pay somebody for something than give it to me, because then you're beholden to them in a certain way. And so that can be really dominating. So I think there are different kinds of markets and things that there are things that aren't parts of markets. Yeah.
Catherine, why don't you interject quickly?
Can I interject, because I think it integrates something that Wayne was saying and what you were saying, which is that if the business plan is there, you can't choose not to draw up a business plan if it's the part of your form. So there's not a voluntarism that Wayne can opt out of writing a business plan at this point. But can I just make a larger? Wait. So I was thinking that maybe what we're talking about is also scientific management and Taylorism and the history of management efficiencies. Because if we go back to Stephen's point, I'll take it. Let's say the university has nothing to do with capitalism, but it does have a lot to do with managerial trends now. And it's managerial trend, the Taylorization of universities is doing efficiencies. And so this efficiency that is also a favorite watchword sort of changes between sort of business management science and economics, because the markets are supposed to be efficient, but also there are more and more managerial styles that are more and more efficient. That said, I think that there are things to be said for well-managed or large organizations. And the humanities, so often we take the sovereign, autonomous position and say, oh, we're beyond all that. What actually happens is we can't manage our way out of a paper bag. So that's my response to Georgia. And
can I?
So, some of us can't manage our way out of a paper bag.
I didn't say all of us can manage our way out of a paper bag.
Can I make a quick comment
Sure,
on this?
go ahead.
Okay, you want to go first?
No, you first.
I just wanted to relate what's been said to this whole business of the market, and I think I agree that maybe we should talk about the market, but at the same time, I think there's specific ways of not talking about the market. I mean, we have to be specific in how we do not talk about the market. Like, for example, if you say, at the moment, it's not important what the object is, it's important how much it costs. Now, I mean, that creates a certain notion of a kind of market, right? I mean, it's a market of money and so on. And if I take my cue now from a cultural critic like Guy Debord, right? Guy Debord says, a second stage, a second kind of market would be this. If the first kind of market is from being to having, right? Not what something is, but how much it costs. A second stage, he says, is the stage from having to appearing. Right? Now, here you have another kind of market, which is the market of images. Right? How images then become as important as in the measure of value. But I think today we have to, even go beyond that and postulate a third different kind of partial market, which is this moment when we go from appearing, right? Like the second stage is from having to appearing. The third stage might be something like from appearing to disappearing. But when I say disappearing, what I have in mind would be things like information. I mean, the thing about information is that it doesn't always express itself as an image. I mean, you can't see it partly because it moves too fast. And here you have the market for all these things that we classify as information, and it's in that context, I think that a lot of the market, in fact, works now. Now, of course, this is not saying that there is such a thing as the market, but then the fact that there isn't the market, I mean, that also takes these specific historical forms.
Yeah, I've pronounced the terrible word "the market," and I have to explain a little bit. Well, I agree with this criticism. The market is not an entity, an abstract entity. For me, it was just a way to say that the current state of a developing economy is about the complete financiarization, could you say
financialization.
Okay, of all activities. And this is a problem. So it's what I call the market. And I was short. I need to go straight to the point. So, well, of course, the local market around the corner and the global market are not at all the same thing. I agree completely with that. But to make me understand.
Make myself understood.
Don't make myself understood. Thank you. I will read a paragraph of a statement which has been done last spring by some faculty at UCSD regarding the current state of the change in decided Ulster. The UC Committee on the Future, tasked with recommending change to the university system, employs the traditional economic concept of competing goods, in quotation marks. As it deliberates over how to deliver access, affordability, and quality, the value of each is assessed in terms of its price tag, and then weighed against the other goods. Asking how to balance these competing goods is tantamount to inquiring whether we prefer to educate fewer and wealthier students and to collect higher educational fees, or whether we will permit our students' educational experience to be inferior, their preparation more mediocre, and their degree less competitive. Under none of these outcomes will UC remain a true public university. I think this is the point. Is the point of transforming the educational system in a competing system, in the sense not the competing in quality, but competing in just in terms of cost, in terms of revenue, in terms of profit. That's the point, what I call the market. But is not the market as an angel or a devil, is really a procedure, a certain way of understanding how, for instance, education, which is for us part of humanities, or well, maybe humanities is part of education, but this logic of profit, which now insidiously operate everywhere in our way to just understand culture and education. That's the point.
Steve?
Yeah, I think I want to agree with Georgia and disagree with you, Marcel, and maybe a little bit controversial, but I don't see this as profit. I see this as the fact that we have to make choices. Maybe this is my economics thinking here too, but choices require valuation. And valuation is not all about money. So budget constraints do matter. But what goes into that budget constraint, and what are the choices that you're going to support or not support, are something that has to be taken into consideration. The public university, like the University of California, lives in a world, in an economy, state, which has limits. And those limits are focused on and debated right now between the public and the private. There's a lot of things you can say about that, and I have to say that public universities are not necessarily the most financially progressive ways to fund a university, because in fact it's an economically regressive way to fund a university, because rich kids go to universities on very little fees. But I think what we're missing right now is that the fact is we have to put our story forward, what we value. And if we value low-cost education, and we want to do that, that's one thing. If we value other priorities, that's another thing. We have to say if we value an organization that's not going to be run like a managerially efficient firm for various reasons, that's another thing. But if we see that discussion, then we're not going to get into the table. We're just going to let other people take over and say, this is what has to be. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be, but we do have to meet some constraints. We do have to pay the workers. We do have to get the funds from the students or the state. It's not limitless resources, but there are always going to be trade-offs and choices. And the struggle is what are those trade-offs and choices going to be about? And I think that we want to create I don't think that the University of California as a place to work is probably better than Microsoft right now as a place to work. Just as a quality of life. But Microsoft is a capitalist company. University of California, I don't think is. But the University of California is a lot better than many other companies in the world to work in. Choices have been made about how we organize ourselves, what a university is. And I think that what I don't see enough from humanities and other people in the university, not just humanities, is this discussion about what the university really should be. What should be, because we can pay for it, but we have to make some trade-offs. We can't have everything, but we can pay for it if we want to do it. We might have to give up some things. The question of, tenured labor versus non-tenured labor. That's an important question. How do we think about that? How many students do we want to teach? Do we want to teach to the master plan again? The question that's come up, and I think it's an interesting one too, is the cross-subsidization of support in the university. Some scientists used to think that humanities are living off the grants and contracts of scientists. We know that's not true right now. In fact, the opposite is the truth.
Yes, they make a huge deficit.
They make a huge deficit that we end up paying for. So, well, why do we have science then? It's like, why do we have athletics programs? Berkeley at least had this discussion. The faculty at Berkeley had a discussion about their athletics programs, and they cut back six sports in athletics, and they made some tough decisions there. I don't see any of us raising questions about why do we want to have, microbiology department or something like that. I think there are good reasons to do this. I think there are good reasons to do scientific research, but why don't we raise these questions? Because it's not a matter of just being profit. I just don't see the profit. I don't see a budget constraint as being a profit motive. I see a budget constraint as being something that can be met in all kinds of different ways. It can be either crass financial calculation or it can be more broad calculation, but people still need to get paid, so there is going to be an economic element to it. But let's have that discussion. What is the university about? What is it for? What do we want? And we recognize that we can't have everything right now. We never could have had everything either. That's a false argument, it seems to me. But I'm just shocked at this moment of crisis in the university. We're not having this discussion enough.
Marcel?
No, I agree with this necessity of having a good economy in the university system. But for me, it's a difference between good management and teaching for profit. This is the point. And maybe it's not your point, but is a trend. And I've read a lot about that. I feel really is a dangerous one. And is in that trend, humanity will just be destroyed as it is.
Well, if we were teaching for profit in humanities, at my college, I would get rich. If we've talked
for
about
what?
If I got my fair share,
get rich on what?
You want to hear it?
Yeah.
If I have UCR right now, I have over half the student body at UCR is in my college. Now, most of those students are funded by the state. All the students bring in tuition revenues now, over $10,000 a year. About 2,000 students are not funded by the state, but okay, forget those for a minute. So $15,000 per student funded by the state, plus $10,000 funded by their tuition revenues. Give me all that money, because of my majors, in my college, I should have 3 times the budget I have. I don't. If you got paid according to the student body that was supported by where they go and take courses, I would be rich and the scientists would be poor.
Yeah.
School of engineering would disappear. Why? I made that case to my administration. They didn't go for it. But don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we shouldn't do science. I'm not saying we shouldn't do athletics, because those are programs, just to pick on those two,
but I wonder,
get subsidized by us.
I wonder whether you're not collapsing the notion of profit. I see that as revenue streams, which I think is central to whatever form of capitalism rather than profit making. It's not profit. You're getting money from the state.
I'm not saying it's profit.
Yeah.
I'm not saying
it's a revenue stream.
That's right. And, give me my revenue stream.
Yeah.
We'll have a lot of humanities if that is the case.
Though not necessarily.
I agree with that.
High-paid humanities professors too, by the way.
We have a lot of humanities teachers. It's not clear we'd have a lot of humanities research.
Well, that depends on choices made
right.
with what you do with that funding.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And the limits that you can take that funding to,
right.
in terms of direction and redirection.
If you have enough teachers, then you can then there's enough time for them to make.
And whether you're prepared to have large classes with a small number of teachers.
Yeah.
Right.
The revenue stream from which you then put.
But David, if we were paid the revenues,
that's good management.
If we were paid the revenues that the students generate from humanities professors, we could have professors, tenured academic senate to tenured professors teaching languages.
Let's start the revolution now.
There's a question.
So we have revenue sources. We just don't make the case.
So Shane Butler, UCLA Humanities Consortium. I'm chasing all of, even though I agree with everything that's just been said in particular, I'm chasing some elusive problem here, and in the course of that, trying to make sense of my weird day, which led me to be late, for which many apologies, but it actually turns out to be relevant. So what I'm trying to figure out is okay, I mean, I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination, but there's very little human activity that I don't instinctively understand in terms of value, that I describe in economic terms, that I see as an economy, can theorize as an economy. My question is not about, my question to myself, and ultimately to all of you, is not about the sort of epistemological value or historical value of that instinct and those terms, but the sort of the value and disadvantages of the practice of doing that over and over and over again. I think that's swirling around some of the questions about, you know, economics as authority, economics as a metaphor. If we keep doing that, even if it works, is there a cost that we pay? So that brings in why I was late. You know, I was on a 20-person UCHRI conference call about teaching. Now, God knows what passes through everyone's minds when I say that, but let me assure you, it is not what we talked about. The conversation was solely about the following. The Office of General Counsel at the Office of the President is very upset because faculty members are putting their lectures on YouTube. And don't they understand that the university actually owns whatever they do in the classroom? And so this whole gigantic, ridiculous conversation, which we could talk about in so many economic terms and place in so many different economies, both local, we could atomize UC and understand the various economies inside the university. We could look at the various economies outside the university that are bringing the pressures for online education. There's an effort to commodify us all, monetize us all. Everything is going on. But at some point in that conversation, I realized that the reason that the conversation was irrational was precisely because everyone was insisting on speaking in economic terms. That is to say that I kept saying, everyone kept saying, yes, but in crass economic terms. The proof was that they preferred to talk about money, right? So people kept saying, yes, but like I have this colleague and he's like selling it for like $10. It's like, well, what if he didn't sell it? Well, you know, that might be okay, but these other people are selling it, and oh, but the university might want to sell. Everyone wanted it to be about money, and nobody wanted it to be about, well, teaching, which is what the conversation is supposed to be about. Or distribution, exactly. Now, let me just make it perfectly clear once again. I can recover teaching in economic terms, right? What I'm trying to understand, though, is whether economy intervenes, economic terms intervene to identify an economy, and then invite regulation, like the 20-person conference call, which I wasted my morning and missed your talks. I mean, that's what I see in an institutional context, is economic language as a kind of an economy unto itself. Does that make any sense? I mean, there's a kind of...
Or maybe a master discourse.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like that's the only way in which we can understand it. I mean, and of course you all were just doing this. Like, what is you ask, what is the university for? What is it that we value? I mean, believe me, I'm there for that conversation, but the terms are the same.
Well, Marx wasn't so wrong, right? I mean, Marx was not so wrong. It's determining not just in the last instance, but in the first instance as well.
Wait, were they putting that in the YouTube? They're doing that instead of lecturing?
No. These are
so they would give their lecture and then they put
them
on
giving them away, and they shouldn't give them away because you see owns that content.
I thought university meant universitas.
Yeah, well.
This is
No, I mean, it is tied up, of course, with online education and the need to brand.
There's so much money around this question. I don't want to like suggest this is anything but a money conversation.
Right.
But if we turn it instead into a value conversation, I'm not sure that's success.
As moral value, value as meaning.
I know, but I don't know.
But moral value.
I don't want to talk about value.
But moral values.
I teach Latin, and the first thing I say when I teach, my Latin students is, I'm going to teach you something that's completely useless. And I over and over again perform. I know. This is just it. If I instead stand up and say, well, with this language, you can, broaden your mind and understand the past and everything else, I can do that. But I'm tired of that apologetic language, which necessarily recaptures what I do for some kind of economy, even if it isn't a financial one. I mean, that's what I'm asking. Is that the danger?
But what's wrong? So let me just get this straight. So, I think Steve's right. You could say that whenever we choose A instead of B, we can translate that into economic terms, but that doesn't, that says something more about us than the fact that we make all sorts of comparisons and contrasts and valuations and equalizations all the time that aren't financial. To say, it doesn't seem to me that knowing about the past or getting insight into the past is necessarily putting an economic value on it. It's putting a value on it.
Yeah, different value.
It's not putting an economic value on it.
That's precisely my question, though, is whether that's not far enough away from the overarching metaphor of economics. And that's why, in other words, I guess what I'm saying is that, okay, we can either understand the crazy conversation I had this morning as being the product of market forces, various markets, various possibilities to commodify and monetize what we do, internal economies and external economies. Or we can also understand it as a consequence of being unable to talk about what we do except in terms of value. So if what I do is valuable, I may understand that it's valuable because it gives moral value. But UC says, well, if it has moral value, then somebody will pay for it, right? Because value is value. Like one economy can slide into another. That's how they. I'm not saying that's the way it works. But I'm saying I hear that slippage in the way in which
but to say you're doing it in and of itself is already to assign a certain kind of value to it. There's no getting away from the question of value, right?
Right. We can't.
The slippage is. The slippage to which you're pointing is an interesting one. Is the question that once you raise the question of value, you've already slid into the question of economic value.
But if you have to make choices, you have to. I think this is where Steve's point is really helpful, because if you have to make choices, you make them on some basis, and that basis has some set of values. Now, they may be intellectual values. They may be that.
Yeah, but his question is a more radical one.
But I understand.
That once you're into value, you're already into economic value.
I think part of the issue is that the shared language we have, that most of us have very few tools to talk about what's important and why things are important. And we certainly don't share our notions of why those things are important. And therefore the economic language of sort of utilitarian value becomes the language we can agree on, because we don't have to get into this fuzzy-wuzzy area of why is it that I love Latin? And why should you love Latin too?
I think absolutely. It's really. I'm again suggesting this is more a rhetorical question.
Right. No, I know.
A question about rhetoric. Because even when you say important, you're moving us toward a different language.
You can say what I care about.
That's great. That's an erotic language, right? What I love.
What I care about. That's not.
Or an emotional.
Well, that's preference.
No, that hasn't come.
No, this is about love. Yeah.
Hi, Soraya Atlas, UC Berkeley. I really like the exchange, your quote, Marcel, and the exchange you had right after that quote around the question of the university as becoming a market, profit-oriented space. For me, it highlights the difference of perception between what the general public thinks and what actually real economists or theoreticians of economy think. Because I think that for the general public, as we have many examples of what happened last year at UC Berkeley, they really do think that the UC is becoming mostly a place oriented towards making profit at the detriment of the transmission of knowledge. Last September of 2009, performance studies students performed an auction, and they sold UC Berkeley, they sold the Campanile, they sold the stadium. I think it perfectly illustrates perfectly well Marcel's point, your quote. So it brings me to a part of your presentation that I would like you to eventually elaborate a little bit on. The second point, in your second point, you talked about the transmission of knowledge in oral societies, and oral societies are mostly based on an oral transmission of knowledge and written societies. And I'd like to know if what do you think about this concept or question of transmission now in the frame that you established? Well, when profit opposes and destroys the phenomenon of exchange as established in what Marcel Mauss called total social phenomenon. In other words, what becomes of transmission with this nihilistic angle you showed us of the market profit-oriented societies versus another type of society where total social phenomenon would be prevalent? I don't know if I made myself.
Yeah, this is a very interesting point. Actually, I've written something about that.
That's what I was.
And I didn't have time to read it. I think it has to do with. I'm not saying that the economy should be suspected systematic. It's not my point. I'm saying that on the contrary, that one of our problems is that for centuries we have neglected or ignored among scholars that economy belongs to the public sphere. And now we have to admit it because it's a fact that we cannot avoid. It's everywhere. But the new means of communication and transmission, to me, is not just the market as been mentioned, but this exchange based on profit and for the sole scope of profit. That's the point. Because profit is also legitimate. I'm not saying the opposite. The question is, there is in this network or those networks of exchange a new status of the works, the literary works, all kind of works of painting, music, a new status, which is that we don't relate to them in the same way that we used to do in our traditional education, which is to receive it in a very passive way. Now we have to admit that all of this network of works, work of art, whatever we can call it, are part, not something we have just to transmit in a scholarly system or in university or schools, but they operate within those networks as a moment of critical change in our relation. They are themselves interpretation of our culture, of our environment. It's not just us who have to comment on them. They are changing us, and changing us through this new way of communicating. So that will be a long discussion.
At the symbolic level also, this whole transformation would affect.
Well, is at the same time is a material level because they are means. Mm-hmm. They are stored in computer and the networks in the internet, but they are also at the symbolic level, meaning we have not the same relation to literature, for instance, at all. It's not just something we can read and comment is something that now circulate in such a way that they change our very way of thinking, but
and of giving means.
yeah, in that sense.
Yeah,
so it's it's well, it's very complicated to explain. It's just intuition. Maybe some people here can explain it better than me, but I'm convinced that there are new possibilities that didn't exist before, and which can bring a kind of integration of scholarly culture, folk culture, and mass culture. And I'm sure that the vanguard of the last 70 years have just explained that, how to capture these energies and to transform it in a kind of work can disseminate into this network of relation in which we are. So is a new pedagogical relation, is a new culture which is emerging, and probably a new way of imagining, of thinking, which is on the way. And my concern is, in that process, how money will intervene and say, oh, there is really interesting stuff for us, let's control it. I mean, nobody will say that. Yeah. It's a process. So it's not a plot theory. It's just a way of expressing this type of relation. So maybe the new God is a network, but thing is really what is changing is our relation to what we have received from the previous generation, and what is producing now is a new style, is a new means of doing things. But exactly what I would like to know.
You had a question earlier on.
Well, actually, it was looking back to what you were dealing with earlier today, and at least my understanding of how authority functions in institutional settings is the interplay between the promotion of authority and the acceptance of authority. And I mean, if you look at religions, since this has been raised on a regular basis, it's amazing over a century or two settings where what wasn't authoritative becomes authoritative because it's accepted as authoritative. And it's really hard to tell at what tipping point it moves then to the hardened authority, and it's impossible to resist. And I take your point about efficiencies versus economics, but I wonder in terms of post-secondary education if we've not moved to a paradigm that's almost possible to resist now from an economic side. And the question then of how humanists engage that and engage it in a way that is going to be that you can survive easily.
Maybe some last words from the panel?
Well, I didn't say anybody's going to survive easily. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's a struggle. I think there's a real difference between recognizing that we live in a world of constraints of different kinds, and recognizing what those are, and figuring out how to deal with them. But putting on the table what you value, what you think is important, as opposed to somebody else. And don't let somebody else just tell you what's important. If you think that higher education with small class sizes and teaching language courses are important, then make that case. If you don't, then somebody else is going to make a different case. And don't be shy about that. And I think the defeatist attitude is to say humanities doesn't have any resources. I just find that to be so defeatist. It's not like we're teaching 10 students. We're teaching a lot of students, at least from what I see. We teach a lot. History classes, philosophy classes, English classes are big classes. And those are people, who are students. And some of them might say they're our customers. I won't say they're our customers. I'll say that they're our students for various reasons. I resist that language. But I don't understand. Right now we're in a moment of transition, there's no question. but transitions just don't come out preordained. And just because we have budget constraints, again, we always have had budget constraints. But how we meet those constraints, to say we have budget constraints doesn't say we're capitalist, doesn't even say we're corporatist. We're just saying we're living in a world of trade-offs. And I don't know when we've ever lived in a world of not trade-offs. Whether it's time, energy, money, resources, priorities. But just because you've got some people telling you in the office of the president what those trade-offs should be doesn't mean we have to accept them. And there are plenty of people in the university right now who are resisting. So.
Some closing remarks?
You first.
All right. I mean, for the most part, I would want to echo what Steve just said. And I do think we want to make very clear that there's a distinction between the existence of constraints, right, which is not peculiar to any particular set of societies. I mean, we're feeling it particularly hard now, but it is at least partially coincidental that we are feeling it particularly hard now at the same moment that some people are telling us that the way we have to choose how to allocate those reduced amounts of dollars is in terms of a certain set of economic valuations. I mean, I actually heard somebody at a budget committee meeting not long ago propose that a good way to value majors was to look at the average income 10 years after graduation of the people who took those majors. I'm not entirely sure if that person was serious, but I also wasn't sure that he wasn't, right? And that's a kind of economism, right, that could actually exist in flush times too, right? You could have tons of money and be thinking about expansion. Absolutely. And be weighing it that way. Or you could have hard times and making the choices along very, very different lines. So I think we want to keep those two things apart. And then I think there's yet a third thing that we want to keep separate from the other two, which is the question of even if one grants the importance for certain utilitarian purposes of thinking about things in this economistic way, in terms of how much money does this generate, that does not necessarily imply that the best way to analyze those questions is through a sort of neoliberal invisible hand kind of analysis, right? Because there could be all sorts of other things going on that determine the value that people put on things, determine the price that they're willing to pay for them, so on and so forth. So I think we've got at least three different things that we want to make sure we don't lump all of them together under economics, because they're really quite separate.
Marcel?
Well,
no avoidance now.
No, I agree with that. But I just like to insist again that, speaking as an anthropologist in that case, that if we compare the way the traditional society functioned and the situation which is our situation today, it's clear that education, values, everything is a collective transmission, and even they are not this type of concept in traditional society, is first of all a public good. And whatever the good management should be in public in institution or education, whatever they are, and I agree with that, must be well managed, and the economy must be rational as much as it can be. But if we lose the scope, which is to pass down to the next generation our knowledge, our experience, and if we decide that the access to it depends how much you can pay, I think this is unfair society, is an undecent society. That's my point.
Well, maybe one final reflection I can take from Walter Benjamin, who was not a very good economist. I mean, I think what he can tell us about everything that we've been discussing maybe is the following. When he says when you study something now, it's not a question of deciding beforehand what is the right object of study and what is the wrong object of study. That you're always beginning with what he calls the object riddled with error. You're always dealing with objects riddled with error. And the situations I think that we're in are also situations riddled with error. So, I mean, for example, at one level, obviously, we have to resist, but it's not a question of being really very clear about what we are resisting, what it is that we are against and for. So maybe the only way to proceed is to not, for example, mark the antagonistic points of view as absurd, but rather to follow the certs in the system, where all the certs in the system that might, as it were, lead us somewhere else and maybe allow us to take another turn.
Steve.
I've said enough, I think.
Please join me in thanking our speaker.